Hey, I'm Ali, and in this video, we're going to be breaking down the fundamentals of HTTP requests and APIs Masterclass. I'm going to show you how you can start to understand HTTP requests like a pro, and by the end of the video, you'll be able to look at any API documentation and start creating requests for yourself. These skills will allow you to start creating more complex workflows that you can sell and create for clients for more money. So if that sounds interesting to you, then please do stick around to the end of the video. We'll be diving into the fundamentals of HTTP requests, the fundamentals of APIs, different HTTP headers and body types, some practical examples, and then some general tips and tricks. So let's get into it. APIs, HTTP requests, and webhooks masterclass. This video is going to be for anyone who has no idea what any of this means, and by the end of the video, you're going to be able to go onto any software, any application's API documentation, and be able to understand how to retrieve and get and send data the way that they want. So let's get straight into it. Let me get my fancy laser pointer. So this is going to be the structure of the video. We're going to start off with the fundamentals of HTTP servers, understanding the fundamentals of APIs, HTTP methods such as like headers and bodies, understanding the authorization and content types. And then we're going to actually be showing a practical implementation. So actually going onto a website's API documentation and understanding it that way, fundamentals of HTTP response types, and then some general tips and tricks. So let's get started. Fundamentals of HTTP servers. So first of all, you got to understand what HTTP stands for, which is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. What this means in terms of an analogy is that when you try to visit a website, or in this case, I guess the analogy case, when you try to make an order at a restaurant, you would basically be telling the server, or in this case, a chef, what you want. And this is essentially a HTTP request, and that's what it entails. Then the chef brings you the food, or in this case, the contents of the website, which is known as server packages, for you to see on your screen. So for example, if I were to go on my computer and if I were to type in my web browser, Sharp AIs, so if I literally go here and type in sharpais.com, you'll be able to see that I sent a request to the server and it returned back HTTP server packages of basically the contents of this website, right? That's essentially what a HTTP server or request can kind of entail. So now that we kind of understand Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which is basically just, going onto the internet and basically asking the servers for stuff, and then the internet comes back to you with obviously content, we can understand what APIs are. And APIs stand for Application Programming Interface. And APIs are so fundamental because this is pretty much how we send data across the internet. It acts as a universal system that we can use to send information/data from one side of the internet to the other. And this is also just another block diagram I made where the user is essentially making a request. And this is a pretty cool, I guess this is a pretty decent example because I'm sure most people watching this know what OpenAI is, know what an OpenAI key is and how you have to use it for absolutely everything. So we basically make a request with this API key to OpenAI, right? To use their chatbots, to use their models, assistants, etc. Then the server or OpenAI sends a response back using that API. So it uses our, billing in this case, or our tokens, and gives us a response. So I could basically this is basically like creating an AI agent that you give a prompt and you give some text, right? It's the exact same thing. You got to put in your model, you got to put in your API information or your API key, and then you can actually use the AI agent, right? Same thing. So now that you kind of understand APIs and how it's pretty much this tool that's used to transfer data from one side of the internet to the other, and all the different softwares that have API keys, literally every single one, we can start talking about the actual that's such a hard word, HTTP methods, such as headers, bodies. But first of all, I want to actually show you the two main methods. So these are methods. And this is pretty much like 99% of the time what you're going to be working with when you make HTTP requests to the internet. You're going to have a GET request, which, as the name suggests, you are just getting information. Kind of like watching the news to know about the weather, right? You're just getting information. Whereas when you make a POST request, here you're adding new information, kind of like placing an order, where you're adding new information to the restaurant's order system, right? So now we can actually start talking about HTTP headers. And what exactly is a header? What is a body? Let's not worry about bodies right now. Let's just focus on headers. And you can think of HTTP headers as an envelope for web communication. So I guess to break it down, HTTP methods consist of headers and bodies. And the header is, basically the envelope of web communication. So this could basically, if you think about it, be like the address, the postage, and the instructions on an envelope. And what it does in theory is it provides context for requests and responses. What it doesn't do is contain the actual data of the response. So that's the body. And then I have this little envelope to kind of show you that, hey, header is basically the envelope. It's basically the packaging. And then the body is actually what's inside of it, right? So common HTTP headers. So now that we kind of understand what a header is, what does it actually include? Like, what even is it? Well, there's a few different headers that you'll probably see a lot of when you go into API documentation or when you make HTTP requests. I'm sure you would have seen this already, but there is always going to be an authorization header, which is basically your password to access this resource. And this always consists of like your API key so that, you can obviously make those requests and it obviously bills you. And then you also have content type. So this is basically how the data is structured. So this could be HTML, JSON, or XML. 99% of the time, the data that you pretty much send is going to be structured in JSON. That's how the internet basically reads data. And then host you probably won't ever use, to be honest, but I put it in here just in case. Host is the URL, right? The actual URL you're trying to get the information from or basically produce. So basically you're requesting this content from this URL or whatever. And we'll show a more practical implementation of this later. So don't worry, it's not just theory. We're going to be diving into some actual practical implementation. Man, I cannot speak. It is like 7 o'clock right now. I haven't had coffee, so apologies for that. But why do headers actually matter, right? There's obviously a few reasons why we have headers in all of our HTTP requests. And I don't think there's ever going to not be a HTTP request that you make that doesn't have a header. So first of all, it's security, right? You have to use your API keys. That's why everyone on the internet blows out their API keys or says that they're going to take it down because it's very sensitive information and it can contain a lot of things such as like billing, mainly billing information, right? Like for example, when you have an OpenAI key, you have to put in your billing information to obviously get that key. And if that key is exposed to the internet, people can just use it and abuse it, right? And then you could just wake up losing thousands of dollars because some guy decided to run like a chatbot like overnight consistently, just burning through your money in tokens, right? So obviously we keep it for security reasons. Performance is also really good. So you can actually use cache control to faster load. And basically what cache control is, it basically just stores your packages for you. Honestly, you don't even notice it. Like HTTP requests are quite instant in their nature. Like it only takes about like 5 seconds maximum. And then obviously compatibility. So the actual content type tells the browser how it should render the data. So this is kind of going back here where we basically tell it, is this HTML? Is this JSON? Is this XML? Great. Okay, that's how we want the content to be rendered. A real world example is basically headers decide if a website loads as a mobile app or a desktop site. And I guess now it's time for an example. I don't know why I put that there. The example is going to be later on in the video, but now that we've kind of, actually, no, you know what? I'll show you an example. I think this would be a great time. So to show you an example, I want you to go onto a website called Postman. It's quite simple, just postman.com. And this is essentially the #1 software you want to be using to actually test sending API requests. This is what I use to send and test all of my API requests before I go into N8N or make.com and actually create it. So what you want to do is you'll probably get put to this space. You probably have to create a workspace. And once you do, you can click new request for send an API request. And what this is going to do is it's going to load an entirely new interface. It's super clean, so hopefully you don't get overwhelmed here. But basically, we have kind of like a playground for us to use. So this is basically what I was talking about beforehand with the get and post. You can see that there are 5 other different types of requests. There's put, there's patch, there's delete, head, and options. But honestly, you're not going to use these at all. And then obviously you can type a new method, but we're just going to be focusing on get and post because these are pretty much 99% of the time the ones you're going to be using. So that's how that works. Then here is basically the URL. So kind of like what we were talking about here, where the host is basically where you're requesting this content from. So we can basically just put in like a URL that obviously, you know, exists. I'll be showing you what URL we'll actually be using in a minute. We have query parameters. So we have all these different tabs. We'll be going through this one by one. So we have parameters. We're not going to be focusing on this yet. I'll come back to this. Authorization. Once again, you don't really need to use this because a lot of the authorization is actually done in this third tab, which is the headers. So this is basically what I was talking about in the PowerPoint is the headers. The headers can obviously include like authorization. So you can obviously type in authorization and then you can put in your value. So you can see up here, it says key, value, and then description. These two are mandatory, key and value. Key is basically the name, so authorization, and then value is basically obviously your API key value. There's also content type, which it also, you know, shows it for you as well. And then here you can put like application/JSON or whatever the request entails or wants you to basically make. Right, so that's basically how you do it. And then description is optional. So this could be like, this is how the data is transferred. Right, very simple. We're not going to focus on body scripts and settings. This is kind of just the aspect that I want to focus on to not overwhelm you. So let's actually kind of show you where and how you even, you know, decide your content type, your authorization or whatever. So a great example for this is in my previous video, we actually did some cal.com HTTP requests. And that's exactly what we're going to do in this video to kind of explain it more to you guys on how I was actually able to make those requests. So we can type cal.com. And we can go in developer, we can go to API, so build your own integrations with our public API. Awesome, so this is cal.com's most up-to-date API references of documentation. And on the left here, you can actually see now this kind of makes sense, right? You can see the get, you can see the post, you can see the delete. So you can see what type of HTTP request these entail, right? So if I want to get all the webhooks, that's a get request. If I want to create a webhook, that's a post request. Does it make sense? I think it makes sense. What we want to do, we want to scroll down a little bit and we want to go to bookings, right? This is what I was playing with beforehand. We want to play around with this. So let's start off super simple. And cal.com does a really good job of basically showing you all the relevant headers that you need and everything else that you need. It's really clean. But basically, to get all the bookings, this is how cal.com expects us to send HTTP requests in order to actually get our bookings. So obviously every software that you use is going to have some expected format in order to actually make the request. You can't just make a request randomly. You have to actually follow the guidelines and the instructions by the documentation. But this is really cool. So this is the URL. This is really cool. You can actually just click this and copy it. So now we have the host URL of basically what we're trying to get. So we can go back into Postman and we can do Control V. And this is basically the server URL we're trying to make this request from. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Obviously make sure to change this to get, otherwise it won't work because cal.com expects you to have this as a get. Then we can scroll down here. Ignore this code for now, we'll come to it later. But right now we're just focusing on the headers. So cal.com pretty much shows you the headers that you essentially require. If there's any field that says required, you're going to need to obviously put in that field in order to make the request. So cal.com here requires two different types of headers. Actually three if you think about it, but oh no, actually only two. So in this case, it wants us to, well, we can see here authorization. So obviously you have to give it your cal.com API key, where it basically expects it in the format of bearer and then your token, where your token is basically your API key, prefixed with cal underscore. So what does that even mean? Well, let me go into cal.com. And I think if you go to settings, API keys, you can basically create your own API key here. yeah, I have my API key saved, so I'll quickly grab that and then I'll come back to the video. Okay, awesome. I grabbed my API key. So now what we can do is we can go back into Postman and basically add this header. So headers, we actually don't need content type. So if we go back to cal.com, you can see the only headers we need are cal API version, which is given to us, and then authorization, which we have to obviously get with our API key. It doesn't require content type, so we can actually delete this, which has a nice little icon here. Authorization stays the same, so the way we would put this is bearer and then our API key. For the love of God, I'm going to delete this, so please do not use it. But this is essentially how we would add the headers from the cal.com documentation into Postman. The reason I'm going super slow and super detailed in this is because this is obviously a lot to take in if you're new, and I want this to be fully focused on people that are new and maybe even people who need a refresher. But obviously, you know, as this video goes on, I'll probably speed it up a bit more. And then the cal API version, so we can basically write that in here, add a new key, cal API version, press tab, and then we can actually insert the value which is given to us right here. Awesome. So now if I make this request, because the headers are the only things that are required, we can actually make this request right now. So let's press send and see what happens. Awesome. So you'll see down here, Postman has a few different interfaces. It has this main channel. It has obviously your collection on the side here, but then down here, it actually shows you the response body that you make. So we got a 200, which means the request was successful. So the server has responded as required. And there's a bunch of random information here that you don't need to focus on at all. Don't be overwhelmed by this. This is basically just showing you in JSON format all of my meetings. So yeah, you can see these are basically made from my YouTube videos. So that looks like it's worked. It shows my canceled ones. It shows my other ones, my emails and stuff. Awesome. Looks like it worked. If you get a 200, it means it worked. And then you can just feed this information into an AI agent and basically ask it what you want it to do. Right. So that is how headers work. Awesome. You understand headers? Awesome. Now let's get into the meat and potatoes. So what is actually inside of these envelopes, these HTTP envelopes? And that is the body. So earlier in the video, we basically talked about how there's headers and there's bodies. Headers is basically the outside packaging of the envelope, and the body is basically the content that's stored inside of the envelope. So yeah, you can think of this as the letter inside of an envelope. So what this entails could be a requested body. So for example, when you log into a website, your username and password is sent there. And this basically carries data to the server, either in the form of like a form submission or a file upload. And then the response body is basically this. This is your response body, right? This is the response that we got in the form of a body, right? Very simple. So for example, the HTML images or JSON data that you receive. In this case, we received JSON data. You can see here, there's also XML, HTML, JavaScript, but for this, we're just going to focus on JSON. The body, response body, JSON, makes sense. Awesome. So the key point is the body holds the real content. The headers just describe how to handle it. And I guess here I said, for the response body, this basically carries the data from the server. So what you see in your browser, which, well, I mean, this is what we see in our browser, so awesome. So what is the actual difference between headers and bodies? So I have the headers on the left here, and I have the body on the right. Headers is the label, and then body is the package. So we can go by this row by row, where header is the metadata or the instructions, and then the body is the actual data inside of it. Some examples could be the headers, could include obviously your content type, your authorization, and they're always going to be present, like you're always going to need them. It's always going to be required in like 99.9% of documentation, because obviously that is like for security reasons and stuff. Whereas the body contains HTML code for a web page, or your raw body code. We'll get into this later on, don't worry. This could also include JSON data from an API, and it's optional, right? So obviously in this request that we made here, if we go back to these tabs, we've discussed these 3 tabs, but now I want to get into the body tab. And this is basically what we've been talking about, right? The body. And some APIs don't actually require a body. For this API, it doesn't require a body, right? We were able to make the request simply just with headers, and we didn't need a body. So it's optional, right? You can optionally have a body if you want to. GET requests often don't have bodies. GET requests don't often have bodies because you're just getting information. You don't actually really need to structure it. In this case, we made a GET request, so it makes sense. We didn't really need a body, but we'll be showing later in this video some POST requests that actually do require bodies. It's a bit more advanced, but I'm trying to go through this step by step, like leveling it up. This is the most basic HTTP request that you can make, and we're going to step it up from there. So stay tuned for that. An analogy is obviously your headers is kind of like your shipping label. So where to go, how to handle. Your body is basically what's inside of the box. So the goods that you ordered. And I guess like a real world example could be when you load Netflix, obviously the header is basically telling the server that this is a video stream, and the body is the actual video you're watching, right? So header could be like your Netflix password, your account, and the body could be the actual video that you're watching. So now that we kind of understand that, I want to dive a bit more into some examples of basically authorization and content type. So a bit more explaining these headers and why we use these headers in the first place. So we'll start off with authorization header, which is basically your digital ID. It's like your password, your security, basically sometimes can contain your billing information, such as like an OpenAI key, a VAPI API key, same thing. And what it does is basically it proves that you're allowed to access something, right? It's like a password. It's like authenticates you like a username or password or token, right? Let me actually move my microphone closer. So probably help. So for example, authorization could be formatted as bearer and then your actual access token, which could be your API key. So in this case, if we go to Postman, we actually had to format it as bearer and then our actual API key. If you just do API key, if you don't have bearer and you try to send this information, it seems to still work. So I guess that's optional, but it's good practice to just have bearer at the front so that Postman understands that it's actually an API key. Some examples could be, I guess obviously bearer, your authorization token. And this is kind of like showing a VIP pass to enter a concert, right? So you basically go to the concert, you show them your ID, your VIP pass, that's your authorization, and then they'll let you in, right? Same thing. So some common types could be your basic authentication, which is encoded username / password, which you probably need for like majority of websites such as Netflix that we discussed previously. Your bearer token, so obviously your secure token, which is basically like your API key, your cal.com API key, anything like that. And then a real world use would be logging into an app like Netflix, and the header sends you your credentials securely. So like with Netflix, you enter your password one time, you can click remember, and then you don't ever have to do that authorization ever again because it remembers your authorization ID. And then that was authorization. So this is now content type. We didn't actually cover content type in that HTTP request we made, but majority of times you will have to use a content type header, which is basically the package label. So what it does is it tells the server what's inside your data package. And the purpose of this is to basically specify the format of the data you're sending / receiving. So in this case with Postman, it kind of automatically defaulted to sending the content as JSON. Whereas if we put in here, if we put content type, so you can still obviously make these headers, it's just optional. So if we still made content type application / JSON, by the way, if you're getting confused on how I know this, usually most of the time it shows you in the API documentation, and then Postman's really good where you can just press tab, or it basically autofills it for you so you can kind of figure out and make sure that you're sending the right data, because this is obviously case sensitive. So you have to spell authorization like this, you have to spell cal API version like this, you have to spell content type like this, otherwise it won't work. If I literally just type authorization with a S instead of a Z as we do in Australia, it's gonna not work, right? So it is very case sensitive. So we're gonna change that back to Z, press send, and then obviously our content type returns as JSON format, which, I mean, it does that default anyway, but you can obviously still, add that if you want. I also just hit my microphone, so I hope that didn't hurt anyone's ears. But yeah, that basically tells the server what's inside your data package, and the purpose is to basically specify the format of the data you're sending and receiving. So you could even like put this in your AI agent. It'll be like, hey, the content inside this HTTP request is going to be formatted in JSON. This is like the section that you want to pick out. And in my video 1 week from now, we're actually going to be diving into that and kind of detailing a bit more how to troubleshoot using JSON. But yeah, example would be like labeling a box fragile so the carrier knows how to handle it, right? Very simple stuff. So some practical implications of HTTP methods and their bodies. So now let's actually talk about what you need to use it using a live example. But first, I'm going to go grab some coffee because I am stuttering all over the place. But when I come back, we're going to be making some more complicated HTTP requests, such as get a booking, which requires a lot more stuff. So stay tuned for that. Let's get into it. Okay, awesome. So now that I've had my coffee, let's actually dive into building a more complex HTTP request. I actually said it right that time. That's awesome. So we're going to actually create a booking from cal.com. And this is kind of what I did in my N8N videos. So we're just going to be running it through Postman and then actually showing you how to do that inside of N8N if I have time. So the API documentation to create a booking. This is a post request as opposed to a get request. So there are going to be a lot more parameters that are needed, but I promise I'll explain it. So create a booking. Post V2 bookings is used to create regular bookings, reoccurring bookings, or instant bookings. The request body for all three almost the exact same. Awesome. We can just scroll down here. There's a few things here. So for the header, we actually only need it looks like we only need, it looks like we only need the Cal API version for our header. And let's do that. But first of all, I want to redirect you guys to this right-hand side of the screen where it's kind of showing this C URL code. And this is basically what is being sent to the server. So you know how in Postman we have all of these different screens. We have the URL screen, we have the header screen. This is basically neatly packaging the request so that we can obviously view it in an easy way to understand. Whereas what's actually happening is making this request. So it's making this request, but Postman breaks it down to a lot easier interface to actually understand. And this is essentially what's happening behind the hood. So you have your URL. I guess it would make more sense if I go back to get all bookings. So basically Postman breaks it down, makes it look super easy to use to actually send a HTTP request. But what's actually happening is this request is being sent to the server. So we have the URL, which is the exact same here. We have the header, which is an authorization header. So header, authorization, and then obviously your bearer token, and then another header for the Cal API version, which is basically what we have down here, right? So yeah, that's basically what's being sent to the server. And then for the post create a booking, there are a lot more parameters that are needed. So first of all, we got to start off with the URL. So we can actually copy the URL here to create our booking, and we can just Control V. So this is now API cal.com v2 bookings, and we're going to change this to a post request. Then for the header, so we can actually see here on the right hand side the header, it requires two headers. I think this header is optional, but we're going to include it anyway, which is the content type. It's not required, but we're going to include it anyway. So we actually don't need authorization, it seems. So I might just delete that. We might need it in the future, but we'll see. So content type is down here. And then we want to make this application/JSON. Awesome. And then what's the next one is Cal API version. So we can put in here Cal API version. And then we can put in the Cal API version, which must be set to this. So they actually give it to us. Awesome. So I think those are the only headers that we need. Now you'll see this third field here, the URL being the first and the header being the second. You'll see a third field called data. And this is essentially what I was talking about beforehand, where we pretty much need to send some sort of, it sounded very British. We need to send some sort of data to the server to actually make this request. So the body can contain JSON data from an API, which is basically what we're doing here. And it looks like this data is basically containing the start time, the length, the event ID, the attendees, all of that. What's really cool about cal.com is you can actually create your own JSON data using their own software. So if you press try it, it's actually really cool. You'll basically be able to create your own data structure all within cal.com. So you don't need to write all this out because it looks super complex and writing out JSON is a nightmare. What you can do instead is basically put in your parameters. It also looks like authorization is a required parameter, even though it doesn't say it is, which is interesting. So we might actually add that one back in as well. Authorization. Yeah, I thought authorization would obviously count because like pretty much every single software uses authorization. So I was a bit confused why it wasn't there. Yeah, let's add our API key. Awesome. And we also probably want to add it in here as well. So we're going to use the cal.com native, I guess this is a native Postman if you think about it, to basically create our data structure. Because what we can do inside of Postman is, obviously I breezed over this tab called body, but you can essentially just write the same thing. You can essentially write this inside of here, but obviously we don't want to write that because that is just a nightmare. And obviously there's a bunch of different buttons that we can click here for none, form data. We want raw JSON data, right? That's the data type that we're expecting because in our headers, we put content type as application/JSON, which means that the content that we are sending is going to be structured in JSON. So we can obviously just write out, you know, start date, and then just do that. We can do all that, but we don't want to write it out. And cal.com is really cool because we can put in our parameters in a very easy to understand interface and it'll create our JSON body for us. So let's actually do that. We're going to grab our cal.com header. We're going to grab the cal API version. So body, so there's 3 different options for body. We're just going to go option 0. Attendee, so this is required. Obviously we're going to need the attendee. So the name of the attendee is Ali. The time zone, I think my time zone is just Queensland/Brisbane. Make sure your time zone is actually correct. My email, ali@sharpais.com. Language, this is a really weird interface. I think it's just because I'm on dark mode. But if we find EN, eventually we'll find EN. Here we go, EN. EN for English. This also isn't a required field, so you don't actually need to do these. In fact, just to make it simple, I'm not going to do these. I'm just going to do the required fields. Event type ID. So I think my event type ID, if I go back here, and then if I click on, let's say my 15-minute meeting, this is my event ID. So it's basically this number between the question mark and the slash. That is your event ID. So obviously you have to come to cal.com, create your event ID, and then this is your event ID when you click on your meeting. Awesome. Put that there. Start time. So the start time of the booking in ISO 8601 format in UTC time zone. Okay, so when do we actually want to start this booking? It's actually quite nice because they show us, this is an example. Not this. This is an example, and we can basically just grab this, which is basically the start time in UTC format, and kind of change this. So we're going to change it to 25. We're going to change this to 01. We're going to change this to, oh, actually, let's do the second because this is the last day of the month. Oh, actually, no. We'll do this 31st. So this is basically the year, the month, the day, and then T represents the time. Oh, T represents the time. So this is the hour. Oh, this is the hour in 24-hour format. So this would be 3:30. I think this is 3:30. So I think we'll leave that as is. And then if we scroll down, there's no other required fields. So we can actually just send this request as is. Now you can see here the data has actually populated with what I've put into these fields, which is awesome, right? So now what we can do is we can basically grab this. Make sure don't grab the, I guess I don't even know what these are called, apostrophes. Make sure not to grab this. Grab the stuff inside the curly bracket, press copy. Go back into Postman, click in body, make sure your body is raw JSON formatted, and then you can click paste. Awesome. So this is the response, or this is the request body that we are making to this server URL. And obviously this is important because if we didn't have this data, cal.com would not understand like what type of booking we're making. Like it'll understand we're making a booking, but it won't have the details such as like the name, the time zone, the start time, right? Like it makes sense. If you're making a post request, you're always going to have a body because you're sending information to the server, which is why GET requests don't tend to have a body, because you don't actually need to send data. You're just receiving existing information. I hope that makes sense. But yeah, post request, if you're going to post something to the server, you're going to obviously have to give it some instructions, which we've done here. So I think if we press send, it does not work. Awesome. Attendee property is wrong. Time zone property is wrong. Okay, so my time zone is just wrong. Okay, interesting. Unless I have to do this. This could be a good idea. I don't think I need to though. Yeah, you don't need to. Okay, so it says my attendee property is wrong, and I think it means that it says my attendee property is wrong, but more specifically my time zone is wrong. So I just put in the wrong time zone. What is the time zone for Brisbane? Sure. Do I need to put it like this? I actually have no idea. I don't know how cal.com requires me to put in the time zone at all. It looks like it's like this, but I thought Queensland Brisbane worked. Time zone for Queensland/Brisbane. Yeah, interesting. Let me come back to you and actually find my time zone, what it's actually called, because that is definitely going to be a problem. Okay, awesome. So I had to put the cal.com expects me to make this time zone in IANA format. Actually, no, Postman tells me it has to be in IANA time zone format. So I just looked it up for my location in IANA format. And this is it. It's Australia, Brisbane. I did Queensland, Brisbane. It's Australia, Brisbane. So if I just put that here, if I press send, it still gives me a bad request. Response email error required field. This is what I love about Postman, is it will basically tell you what the error is with the request you're making, which I don't think cal.com does, which is awesome. And I don't think N8N does it either. They don't actually show you like what is incorrect with your response, which is why I love Postman. It's really good for troubleshooting. So it looks like we need the email, which is interesting because the email wasn't even a required field, but I guess we need email. So if I just go ali@sharpais.com, and let me change this as well to Australia, Brisbane. Now what I can do is I can basically copy this and put that in here. And if I press send, it looks like it's going to work. Oh, nope, no, it's not. User has already booked at this time. That is crazy. I've already booked at this time. When have I booked at this time? Have I actually booked at this time? No. It might be my availability, actually. Let's have a look. So today is Friday, 6 to 9. Unless I put the time wrong, could be that. But I think the main issue is user has either already has a booking at this time. Okay, let's change it to 16. User already has a booking at this time or is not available. That is interesting. What if I try sending it inside of cal.com? What happens? Okay, user already has a booking at this time or is not available. That is so interesting. All right, I'm going to come back to this and figure out what's wrong. It looks like actually the timestamp is incorrect. So I guess because we are 10 hours in the future, this may not actually work. So if I do this, okay, I see the issue. So because I'm in Australia, our UTC, we are 10 hours ahead of the UTC time zone. So what was happening here was when I put 16:30, that basically stands for 4:30 p.m. But because we are 10 hours ahead of UTC time zone, which is what is specified here, that was basically creating a booking at like 2:30 a.m., right? Which is obviously I'm not available at 2:30 a.m. So I had to basically minus 12 hours. So in theory, if I put 6:30 here in UTC time zone, because we are 10 hours ahead, this would actually be This would be 2:30 p.m. Does that make sense? This is basically 2:30 p.m. for Australian time zone, whereas if it was just normal UTC time zone, it would be 6:30 a.m. So that's why it didn't work. But now you can see here, we actually successfully created the booking. You don't really need to worry about all this response body. So this response body basically tells us the status, which is successful, the UID, which I cover in extensive detail in my future video. So this is basically a unique ID for the booking, which is really good if you want to feed this into an AI agent. And then the title and then name ID. And then I also got an email. From cal.com, basically saying there's a booking. So we just made that request, which is awesome. So hopefully that makes sense. And you kind of understand a bit more how to create post requests. So let's go back into the PowerPoint and let's talk a bit more about the fundamentals of the HTTP response types. So you've already seen a few of the response types here. You can see that there was a 201 before we had a 401 error, I think. Like, for example, if I just like delete an S from Brisbane, you'll see we got a 400, which is a bad request. So the categories, briefly, you'll have anything starting with 2. So like a 200, 201 is basically a success. So your request actually worked. So a 200 is okay, it's successful, the web page loaded. A 201 is basically created, which is what we had beforehand. We had a 201 when I created the booking, right? Then 300, I don't think you'll ever see a 300, but I put it in here just in case. If you ever see a HTTP response type starting with 3 or 300, it's basically a redirection. So basically look somewhere else. So if you get a 301 HTTP response type, it could be a permanent new address, like a relocated store, or a 302 found, which is a temporary redirect. You won't ever see that though, but yeah. And then we have 400. So anything starting with 400 is a client error. So 400, which is a bad request, which I think is what we had here, which is basically like an invalid input. So in this case, obviously this is an invalid input because I didn't spell Brisbane properly. 401 is unauthorized, so log in first like a locked door. And then 404 is not found. You would have probably seen 404 quite a few times on the internet if you tried searching for something that doesn't exist, or if it's just a broken link. 500, you'll probably see 500 sometimes as well, in case like the server is messed up. So a 500 is like an internal error, there's a server failure, like a crashed kitchen. 503, which is unavailable, so overloaded or downed. I've sometimes got 500 errors when I was creating my websites, so that's kind of when you would see it. But yeah, analogy recap is basically anything with the 200 is great, anything with 300 is basically a redirection, anything with 400 is basically a no-go, and anything with 500 is something that needs fixing internally. Awesome, so some general tips and tricks. Start simple. So kind of like I did at the start of the video, start with GET requests first because they're super easy. Ideally, you want to use public APIs that are free, such as the weather data, GitHub, or even cal.com as well, that's free. Try different tools. So once you get comfortable making GET requests, then do POST, and then you can play around with other ones such as put, delete, whatever. Organize with collections. So Postman obviously has a collections folder here where you can basically store all of these requests. Kind of like files, right? So you can just come back to it as well, which is really cool. Play with the headers and bodies. So add content type to send JSON data, all that stuff, and read the documentation. Always, always, always read the documentation. Get familiar with this type of format, right? Very important that you're able to look at this and understand what you need to do. Now, let's quickly go into N8N and kind of show you that interface and how you would basically create the bookings using that interface. Another thing I really want to touch on is with the reschedule booking and cancel booking, these require the booking UID, which is basically what we covered previously, which is that unique ID for the booking. Keep that in mind because we're going to be covering that in a future video. But let's actually go into N8N and kind of just let's just go into a new workflow here actually. I guess we can just do trigger manually and then we'll just do HTTP. Cool, so if you're using N8N or make.com, you'll basically have a HTTP request node. And obviously there's the different methods. So we're quite familiar with this. In this case, let's just do get. The URL, let's go back into cal.com. Let's do the get bookings. So we can just chuck the URL into here. Authentication, This one's kind of confusing. It says authentication, so you'd think you'd have to put your API key, but you actually don't. This is a different type of authentication, and 99% of the time you can just leave this as none. Query parameters, I didn't really touch on this. I will touch on this a bit later. Headers, that's what we want. So we want to click headers. This is your authorization, your content type. Using fields below or using JSON, we can just use fields below because it's a nice interface. So here you would type your authorization, make sure case sensitive, of course. And then we'll just go back into cal.com because it has my API key and basically put that here. Then we can add a second parameter, which is this cal API version. And then we want to put in the value for that cal API version. And then we can also do content type as well. So this is how you would actually put your headers inside of N8N. And then, yeah, obviously how you do it inside of Postman for testing. Because we've already tested in Postman, we know this is going to work. Send body, we don't need to actually send a body because this is a GET request. But obviously, if we were doing the POST request, what you would do is you'd grab this body data, you'd click send body, and you'd make the body content type JSON, and you'd use JSON, and then you just paste it in here, right? You would basically, if this was a POST request, you would basically just paste it in here, right? Exact same thing. Obviously, this is a GET request, so we don't actually need a body. But if I do that and click test step, you'll see that it was a success, and it basically grabbed all my meetings. Now, what if I want to, because it's grabbing all of my canceled meetings, it's grabbing all of my successful meetings, it's grabbing every single meeting. I want to just see the meeting that I just created. So this is where query parameters come in. Query parameters are basically like filters, right? They're basically filters. And you can see here in the get all bookings documentation for the query parameters, there's a lot of different query parameters that we can set, and this is basically just a filter. That's how you can think of it. The main one we want is the status parameter, which basically filters bookings by status. So you have your available options such as upcoming, reoccurring, past, canceled. You saw in N8N, we had the canceled. We don't want to see the canceled bookings. Why do we want to see the canceled bookings? We want to see the upcoming bookings. So this is very simple. Here's how you do it inside of Postman. You basically go to params. You basically put in your query parameter, which in this case is called status. Once again, it is case sensitive. Status. And I guess we can change this as well. Status bookings. That seemed to also get rid of my parameters, but that's fine. We can go status, make sure case sensitive, and then these are the expected values that cal.com expects. So we want to look for the upcoming and make sure it's case sensitive, of course. So if we click send, okay, oh yeah, it's because I have my body. Yeah, so get requests don't actually use bodies, so we're going to delete that. And then if we send this, we now only see the booking that we made that was accepted. So we got rid of all those random bookings that said canceled, and now we can only see the ones that are upcoming. So that's basically what a query parameter does, is just filters a lot of that data, which is awesome. And then the way you do that inside of N8N is you click this query parameters. You just use the fields below. You don't need to use JSON. And then basically same thing. You basically just grab your status and then you grab your upcoming for the value, test step, and then awesome. It's basically only showing me the booking that we just made, which is accepted. So there's no more cancel. And that's how you make a HTTP request inside of N8N and Postman. I highly recommend playing around with Postman. Postman is awesome. And then you can also see the URL got updated with this question mark for the actual query parameter as well. You don't need to add that into this URL. It'll just automatically do it. But yeah, that is super important for you to understand. And I hope you got some value out of this video. This is a very highly requested video, and now it's your turn to basically play around. You can go into the VAPI documentation, you can go into the cal.com documentation, any free server you can just play around with all of these, figure it out. Super fun, super awesome. And then you can leverage that knowledge inside of AI agents, which I'm going to do in a future video. But yeah, other than that, I hope you enjoyed. Please do leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you've made it this far, and let me know down below any video suggestions that you want me to make in the future. By the time you're watching this, I'm probably on holidays, so I think my calendar is closed, but if it's not, then feel free to book a call down below if you are a business owner or if you want any private coaching or just advice in general, free advice. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of the day, and I will see you in a future video. Goodbye.